Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest today. With me is Jennifer Elder, who's a CPA, certified speaking professional. She helps leaders future-proof their businesses by making smart decisions and staying ethical. Tim Hawks is Managing Director of Unlimited Potential Coaching Specialists in the UK and Director of Global Operations. He is an international speaker and works with organizations to develop organizational culture. And Mark O'Brien is founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, helping companies add innovation to their mindsets and their operations to create discernible competitive advantage. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And this is our ethics challenge. Charity is a foundational value of civil society. The Bible mandates a tithe, which the sages interpret to mean between 10 and 20% of one's income. The government gives tax breaks to encourage charitable donations, and wealthy philanthropists are known to give away billions of dollars. But what if I'm donating 20% or more of my income to charity, and I have plenty left over? Is there anything wrong ethically about having a fleet of exotic cars, a private yacht costing hundreds of millions, or spending $2 million on a birthday party? What about space tourism, custom designer clothes, or owning multiple 20-room estates around the world? Presumably, there's nothing wrong with having nice things or taking vacations, but is there ever a limit? Is it defensible to argue that the luxury industry provides jobs, or is that a smokescreen? Especially in light of stories like the reported slave labor conditions where Fiji water is produced. We don't want the government controlling the choices we make, but when we live a life of excess just because we can afford it, does that undermine the principle of self-discipline and responsible stewardship of the planet that should be part of our system of core values? The floor is open.
Wow. My own sense is that any meaningfully ethical discussion of this topic needs to define plenty, limit a life of excess, and responsible stewardship, and at least consider who gets to define those things. By what or whose definitions are we supposed to abide?
Well, we can certainly go in that direction.
So for me, I think, the world has some rules, doesn't it? Physics, gravity, there are some rules which are inalienable. Then we have other rules like the rules of the road and the laws that we can choose to break or not. And they're made up by humanity. As in this case, the concept of giving to charity, not giving to charity is one that's created by humanity. But it raises the question of how human is it to give or not give? And I really struggle with this. And I think from my point of view, it's very easy to give you my opinion. I can very easily give you my opinion, but there's a topic much bigger than that, which is around, for me, when I thought about this, Yonason, when you sent it through early on, I sort of dug around in it and I came down to, do I like capitalism or am I a socialist? This was my decision, because I concluded that if I was a capitalist, then you spend your money however you like, my friend. I'm not to judge. It's not my place to do so. If I'm a socialist, then we should all share and share alike. And found myself in an uncomfortable sense of thinking that I was a capitalist and that did I care? And as one that doesn't generally give to charity, I found that, and I, to answer that, a struggle. Why do I not? What's the reasons for that? Should I? I think that there's definitely a sense of where your values sit in terms of, are you in the socialist model, or are you somebody who believes in the capitalist side of things?
Now, Mark, you were thinking about how we define things. I was also thinking about from whose perspective are we thinking of this? Are we thinking about it from the perspective of a charity? And I know what they would think. Are we thinking about it from the perspective of the person who has toiled and worked and earned the right to buy the multi-million-dollar yachts? Is that different from someone who inherited the money and did not earn it? No, I think if you have worked hard for your money, personally, I think that gives you a little bit more right to decide how you spend it. If it's just been given to you, that to me adds a little nuance to it. Now, as a CPA, years ago when I was in public accounting, it was interesting because, Jonathan, you mentioned the tax law. Our clients who did not make millions of dollars were typically the ones that hit that limit and often went over it. We found that the people who were in the lower income brackets actually gave more than the people who were in the higher income brackets, not on a dollar for dollar basis, but as a percentage. So I think there's a little bit of a mind shift perspective that happens the higher you go up in those income levels.
I think, Jennifer, there's another group of people there. You've got the people who've toiled hard to make the money. You've got the people who've inherited it. You've also got the people who've backstabbed and trodden on everybody all to get to the top. Do they deserve it? Well, I'm sure all of us would agree they don't. But how would we tell the difference between them and those that have toiled hard and earned it? And you could argue backstabbing and treading on everyone on the way up is the way to do it. You could, you might not, I don't know. And I think it gets a lot harder, doesn't it? And a bit more nuanced when we throw in how did I come and buy that money and what did I use it for?
I think I should say, or maybe I shouldn't say, that I am most definitely not a socialist. And Tim, I don't know if Jonathan told you before this program, but I don't believe in gravity. So I don't know that applies to me. But I think that capitalism and socialism are equally susceptible to corruption.
Yeah.
And, I find myself reading more about things like conscious capitalism or compassionate capitalism. And I don't think, with obvious exceptions, I don't think capitalism necessitates our spirits of charity, our senses of generosity. And I think in the United States anyway, it's pretty clearly demonstrated that people of conservative political leanings typically give more to charity than people of liberal political leanings, presumably because the liberals imagine that it's better to give the government the money so that the government can decide how it should be given back to you or to anybody else for that matter.
That's interesting, Mark. I've heard that, and I've tried to find a source for it unsuccessfully. It's something I would like to believe because it conforms with my way of thinking. It would be if there's anyone out there who has a source for that, I'd like to know it. But what you said about capitalism, socialism, Tim, I feel a lot like what Winston Churchill said about democracy. Capitalism is the worst system except for all the others. And, I think anything else is simply not viable. But as you say, Mark, there has to be a sense of social conscience. Otherwise, you get into the crony capitalism and the corruption.
I think
go ahead.
So part of the issue, I think, we talk about capitalism, and often the word that follows swiftly behind is profit, isn't it? It's about shareholder dividend. It's about payout. Well, I think there is in your conscious capitalism concept, there's this concept, isn't there, of the 3 P's of profit, which is a new type of capitalism, which is people, profit, and planet, where companies strive to achieve all 3 in equal measure. So, okay, we're striving to achieve good profit, shareholder dividend, but at the same time, our planet and our people, the people being the charitable bit here, is delivered in equal measure. And I think that is a capitalism I certainly could get behind, and I think it would be a much more middle of the road approach, and would then lend itself, I think, to a concept of ethically giving to charity in a way that still makes the whole sort of profit piece still sit comfortably with people.
Yeah, the triple bottom line is a great approach to a holistic view of an organization. I liken it to that being a three-legged stool. And you know, if you've ever had one too many at a bar, been on a stool and you lean on one leg too hard, we know, fall over. Same thing with organizations. Those that focus too heavily purely on profitability at the expense of the environment and the expense of people, they suffer. But we can't leave profit out entirely, because that's philanthropy. And at some point in time, somebody's got to contribute to allow for that philanthropy. Do we set guidelines for people like we have in the US that says you can deduct 10% of your taxable income towards charity? Or do we allow people to choose? Now, on the tax law side too, we have graduated tax rates. So the higher you go up in income, the more of your income is going to go to the government. So could we set rules that the same thing? The higher you go up in income, the more you would be allowed to deduct against your income if you contribute to charity.
I mean, there is an argument to say, is that fair? Like any tax.
Right.
I'm not sure I agree with that comment, but
I mean, when you talk about the graduated, I mean, you can certainly make a case either way. You could say, well, everybody should pay 10% because that's fair. Or you could say the rate should go up as you make more because those people can afford it, and that's fair. So we as a society, and the governments will change from election to election and decide where they think that the proper balancing point should be. But I'd like to steer the conversation back. I tried to anticipate some of this in the question that, we're not proposing that there's something wrong with making a profit. We're not proposing that there's something wrong with having luxury items. We're asking, is there a point at which it becomes unethical to indulge oneself? If I had a really good year and I want to trade in my Toyota for a Lexus or a Tesla, I don't hear a strong objection to that. But if I want to get a Ferrari that costs $5 million, that's really excessive. Is there really anything wrong with that? Or is it in some way helping the economy? Is there ever a limit as to
the question that comes to my mind is, what's the difference between enjoying what you have earned and greed?
Well said.
Well, and it's the way you see it as well, isn't it? I mean, I know many people who I work with six-figure salaries who don't seem to have any money and are always rubbing stuff together, and saying, mainly because their kids are at some expensive school and, they live an expensive lifestyle and they eat away at it. And, would they say, oh, I've got plenty of money to give away? And then what if you're earning millions and you're running a yacht and you're just keeping up in the breadline, are you ethically required to give that away at that point? And I think it's how you see it, isn't it? It's if you were in that place and you had the millions of dollars and maybe you had the mindset of somebody who likes to save for a rainy day. Maybe you were brought up in a poor environment and you taught by your parents to save for a rainy day, and you just took it to an extreme extent. The ethics would never really cross your mind. You'd just keep building that number up. But then at what point should, I guess Jonas is saying, should the society kick in and make you? At what point should they, and should it be how much you earn, or should it be how much excess you have? And then it's about how do we judge the excess? If I buy a £4 million yacht, then I have less excess than somebody who rides a bike to work.
And I think you're framing it very well, Tim, that if I want to live in Manhattan, where it's quite expensive, and I want to send my kids to private schools, I'm not necessarily living a profligate lifestyle, even if my income is 6 or 7 figures.
That's where I was going, Jonathan, is thinking
ahead.
about if you're going to, there's excess, there's enjoying what you've earned, there's excess, and then there's greed. I think there is a continuum here. And you can see people that they buy a $100,000 car and they love it. They treat it like it's a family member. They talk about it. They just love it. And it brings them great pleasure. But then I've also known people who they buy a new $500,000 car every 6 months. And it's not because they enjoy the car, it's that they're trying to keep up appearances. Yeah. And does that become waste? That money could be, a couple $100,000. There are a lot of charities that would say, give me just 10% of that.
It's a lot of nurses, isn't it? Or, it's a lot of charity workers you could pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, there are pejorative connotations about terms like, also subjective, about terms like greed and self-indulgence. But among the questions that I had prepared to ask are, if you are somebody who is saving your money because that's responsible, if you're someone who is taking care of your family, if you're someone who wants to, whatever your reasons are, leave your heirs a meaningfully valuable estate, is that greedy or self-indulgent? I have a tough time with that one.
But I think the other thing is, if looking after your family involves taking them all to have their teeth whitened, is that right? I don't know. So I think one of the sort of conclusions I come to with this, which is the only place I can settle on in terms of something that feels comfortable for me, is that I do think every human being should live a fulfilled life. So every human being should live a life where they feel happy. And when Jennifer said about, they buy a car and they love it, great. If you've spent a lot of money on a car and you love it, and it gives you, just as somebody having a dog might give the same fulfillment, and I think the same applies for charities. So for my dad died of a brain tumor, for instance. Now, if I was to get a lot of money, that would be the first place I'd look to put the money, because that would fulfill me. I would be like, I'm essentially giving back to others whom I could save others from suffering what I went through by donating that money. And so therefore, not only is the charity benefiting, but I'm also fulfilled. And so therefore, it's a sort of win-win for everyone. And I think that, when so if we're made to do it, my worry would be if the government said take it off us, or it's taxed out of us or whatever, that it might go to a charity that would not fulfill me, and therefore that would not necessarily be so right. So I think there's definitely a piece in there about some fulfillment alignment element.
Well, and what I hear in that too, Tim, is the notion of paying it forward. I don't know that I necessarily would have thought about it if you hadn't said what you did. But my mom recently passed away after a solid 10 years of declining from dementia and Alzheimer's disease. If I were financially able to make significant contributions for research in that area, I completely agree with you. I would feel exactly the way that you do.
Yeah, and at that point, of course, we don't need a tax or a tithe. The money's coming.
Right.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether appealing to that space, and it's not easy because it's multifaceted and lots of elements, but I think there's when you've got the money and you're free to give it, appealing to individuals, desires that will fulfill them, then it's appropriate. If the yacht fulfills you because you've always dreamt about having one, not just because you need to have one, if it's about you rather than how you appear to others, then I'm starting to feel more comfortable with that.
Well, and I can throw a monkey wrench into this whole conversation here.
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
One of the basic principles of ethics is do no harm. So in this scenario, if somebody is spending gazillion dollars on stuff and not giving it to charity, they're not actively harming anybody. You might make judgments about your opinion on whether they could invest their money differently, but they're not harming anybody. So they might take the other view that it's my money, I can spend it any way I want.
Yeah, but that's not the only principle of ethics. I mean, we do have the concept of good Samaritan or responsible bystander. If I stand by and watch harm being done without intervening when I can, that's also unethical, even if I'm not the perpetrator. So if I have resources far beyond my needs and I don't use those resources in a responsible way, then I think my ethics can be called into question. When I come from a theological point of view, but in the secular world of secular philosophy, there have been many attempts to define good or moral. All of them somewhat inadequate, but one of the most popular is utilitarianism, which says that whatever benefits the most people is what's good. According to that, there really is no room for ethics aside from the calculation itself. If anything I do is not maximally benefiting the largest number of people, then it is by definition immoral. So if I'm buying a yacht when I could be feeding thousands of people, it wouldn't be a question. Now, I am not a utilitarian.
But you are feeding people because the yacht company employs people and keeps them engaged, and they've got shareholders, and they get paid, and they've got suppliers, and then there'll be small businesses trying to make ends meet, they get paid. So you could argue that they are okay. It's not going to sub-Saharan Africa or where we might imagine there's obviously an international balancing up that needs to take place. I'm also intrigued to sort of discuss maybe another time, is apathy unethical? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure at all.
We actually had an episode on that.
Right, interesting. I'd love to listen to that.
Actually,
Jennifer,
I think with Robin.
Jennifer, I was thinking when you were talking about doing no harm, and also granting Tim's point that this really has to do with perspective or point of view. If you are in a position to have, I'm going to say, more than adequate resources, and you recognize that someone is either deprived or being deprived, are you doing harm by not helping that person? I mean, there's an argument to be made that you are. I haven't thought about it. I don't know if that's an argument I would make, but if it seems to me, if that's not a matter of ethics, at the very least, it's a matter of conscience.
There's the difference between commission and omission.
There we go.
Am I actively doing something that hurts somebody, or to Tim's point, is it just the apathy and I'm just, it's somebody else's problem? So a lot of this has to do with perspective on what's going on in our mind, what's our intent. And then there's also the concept of effective altruism, which says you should have the greatest impact that you can. And that doesn't necessarily mean money. Yeah. Could be time. I learned about this related to body parts because my niece donated a kidney because she wanted to contribute to the world, but she was a grad student, so had no money and no time. So,
wow.
How are we making an impact on the world, and are we thinking about it?
There is another ethical element to this, of course, which is, just a sort of a low-level example, but could be ramped up to bigger pictures. But if you give to the homeless person on the street, and then they go and spend it on drugs, you give your liver away, you've given everything, you've got nothing, here's my liver, and it just goes and rots in a hospital because they haven't got time to deal with it or something. There is there's this added problem of, if I do give it, is it going to the right place? How's it being used? You know, what organization am I giving it to? And I think that's why a lot of really rich people start their own foundations, isn't it? To be absolutely certain that they're going to achieve the outputs that they want to with their money.
In fact, in Jewish philosophy, that's the difference between kindness and compassion. Kindness is just giving. I see somebody on the street,
yes.
He wants money, I give him $10. That's an act of kindness. Compassion is with a calculation. What will serve him best? If he's going to take that money and go into the liquor store and buy something that's going to be detrimental, it's a lot more effort to take him to get something to eat, or get something and bring it to him to eat. They can take a lot more creativity and a lot more investigation to make sure my money is going to the right places. But that also figures into the ethics of the question.
Well, and doesn't it also figure into judgment? I mean, if I've made
Yeah.
the decision that I'm going to give something to this person, I'm not sure that the only word that comes to mind is right. I don't know that I have the right to start to make calculations and judgments about how he's going to use it. I've made the decision to give it to him.
I'd say more than the right, I have the responsibility. If I give somebody something that's actually going to be to his detriment, then
Yes.
is
The
that
problem with
not
that is,
part of
Is
the...
it to their detriment?
And how do we know?
And
Well, if he's sitting in front of a liquor store smelling of whiskey,
yeah.
and he says, "Can I have $10 for some food?" Well,
And then the argument is, if we don't know, let's say the compassion argument rolls out in his head as we're standing there with the money about to hand it over, it suddenly becomes really difficult, doesn't it? And so therefore apathy becomes possibly the easiest option. And hence
Easy
our bank
indeed.
balance is built.
and does that stop people from giving when they say, I don't know where the money's going and I don't know how it's being used? So does that stop people who would who otherwise have resources, as you mentioned, people forming their own foundations, but that's a lot of work in and of itself. So, if you're not Bill or Melinda Gates starting a foundation or giving away half of your money, at what, you've decided maybe in the past sometime you were taken advantage of. And you did give money and it didn't go where it should have. There are way too many examples of charities that turned out not to be charities.
and even then, I mean, you mentioned about the Gates Foundation. I was reading an article about how some of the what they've done in the medical field, there's been a certain amount of collateral damage. There are always unexpected consequences. And I could take the apathy approach and say, well, listen, I can never be sure that my money is actually going to help. So I'm just not going to give anything. I don't think that's a healthy approach.
It depends. If it fulfills them and they're happy with, and they don't, there's no guilt, there's no worry, there's no thought about it, then as an individual, they are fulfilled. And who can argue with that?
Well, so here's another consideration. There's a young woman who works for me who has a 7-year-old daughter, and I also have 2 young nieces who live out on the West Coast. And it turns out that they're all involved in Girl Scouts. So they all put the arm on me to buy Girl Scout cookies, and I'm thinking, wow, what could go wrong? And so I bought a ton of Girl Scout cookies, and I found out today where that money goes and how little the troops of the girls who are selling the cookies derive from the sale. And I'm like, and you know what, Jonathan, it makes me concede, yeah, maybe I should be more judgmental about it. I'm not sure I'm going to be buying Girl Scout cookies next year.
I'd like to see you refuse. No, I'm not buying them. No.
Yeah, I'm going to have to break some hearts, but
You are, yeah.
maybe I'll just send them the money.
I have some pretty strong feelings about this term judgmentalism, depending on how it's used. I mean, we have to make judgments.
I know.
Constantly, all through life, and we should. The question is, how are we making? Based on what? Oh, I don't like the color of your skin. I don't like your your ethnicity, I don't like your religion, I don't like the way you comb your hair. I mean, those are not the criteria we should be using to make judgments.
Yeah.
But certainly there are some perfectly valid criteria. Again, it goes back to being work and effort. And sometimes even when we do our due diligence, it still may not work out well.
Which
Yep.
brings us back to your notion, Jonathan, of unintended consequences.
Mm. But if you put your foot first, if you put a foot forward, there's a risk. There's always a risk. But if you don't, you stagnate. And then apathy occurs.
This is also where the gray comes from, is that we make judgments, but from whose perspective? And
Yeah.
you can throw ethical situations out there and you'll get 22 different answers on what's right and from what perspective. That's always the trick to me when it comes to ethics is it seems easy when you take a very narrow, restricted viewpoint. But when you widen that lens and think about all of the stakeholders, like you mentioned, okay, there's the charity that you would give to, but then, okay, you're not buying your $100 million yacht. There's a whole lot of people who are depending upon their living from making that $100 million yacht. So there are consequences with every action, and every way we look at this scenario, there will be somebody that gains and somebody that gets hurt.
I think I'm going to use that, Jennifer. When I win the lottery and I decide to buy that yacht, I'm going to say, yeah, but you know what? There are so many people who are not going to make a living if I don't buy this yacht.
What I'm going to do is buy the yacht and rent it out to charities. That's what I'm going to do.
Well said.
Yeah, I can't go wrong.
You can host, Jim, you can host charitable events on your yacht.
Absolutely, for a small fee.
Yes, now we're thinking outside the box.
Yeah, Tim, I don't know if you think of yourself this way, but you, sir, are a philosopher. I love that.
You know, the in Judaism, the highest form of charity is to help someone find a job, because then they don't need charity anymore. And so if I don't merely start a foundation to give money to people who are in need, but I have the creativity to find ways to help people no longer need help, then that's really the greatest contribution I've made to the world.
Teach a man to fish. It's that storyline.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know if you've ever heard this from a comedian, but he said, you know, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach him to fish, he'll feed himself for a lifetime. Leave the dude alone and he'll figure it out for himself.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, in that model, if you like, that the job it becomes almost a sort of sacrosanct entity, doesn't it, as part of the kindness process. And you could argue, is that ethical or not? You know, because is it about job, or actually is it about self-fulfillment? Maybe they don't want a job, maybe they just need to be and spend some time painting or helping out children or something. So you know, that in itself comes with risk.
And you know, there's another side to that too. One of the most fascinating studies I saw, they showed people a picture of a young woman who appeared to be from some third world part of the planet, and said that this young woman is in desperate need. We need to raise funds to help her. Could you make a donation? To a different set of people, they said exactly the same thing with the same picture. They added one sentence. They said, she's one of thousands of refugees in need of help. And if they added that sentence, the amount of the donations went down dramatically.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And the way they interpret it is that people want to feel they're making a difference. And if it's just one of many, I'm not making an impact, I'm not as motivated to give. And really, charity has two purposes. It helps those in need, but it helps us be charitable.
Yes, stroking the charitable ego.
Yeah, a friend of mine posted on LinkedIn this week where he said, if you're having a bad day and need to feel better, help somebody else.
Yeah.
Mhm,
And by helping somebody else, you help yourself.
mhm. I've actually heard people ask, well, yeah, all right. So if you're helping somebody else because it makes you feel better, isn't that selfish?
Mhm.
I don't think it is. I think thinking that way is self-limiting.
And there's a
Yeah.
big misunderstanding of selfishness, and and what that, where the line's drawn between selflessness, selfishness, and arrogance. I think a lot of people misunderstand that sort of like continuum.
Mm.
It's pretty stratified selfishness if it is. So
Yeah, that's
And-
true.
and
maybe we
sometimes-
could even live with that.
Yeah. and some of this comes back to intent then.
Mhm.
Am
Absolutely.
Yeah.
am I doing this because I want to help somebody else, or am I doing this because I need to feel better?
Well, and if you believe you're doing it to make yourself feel better, does that mean you shouldn't do it?
Well, it comes down to fulfillment, as I said earlier, doesn't it? If it fulfills you, if the purpose is right, the alignment's good, the money's good, you feel like it's serving something, like giving it to that one girl that who'll send you a letter 3 years later to say, I've just finished my studies, thank you so much. That. And I adopted an elephant sort of a few years ago, and this elephant sends us letters with pictures, and I love it. And it does make you sort of think, but you're reminded of the purpose and what you've done, and that does feel valuable.
I mean, ideally, we should do the right thing for the right reason, but it is part of our tradition that do the right thing, even if it's for the wrong reason, because you may end up doing it for the right reason in the end.
Mhm.
Well, it might create a culture of good reason that you perhaps wouldn't generate naturally by yourself.
Yeah, other people see you doing the right thing, and then they're more inclined to do the right thing too. So it does have that ripple effect as well. Well, we've run over, which is fine because it's been a wonderful conversation. And I thank you for your participation. I want to leave you with two thoughts. First, one of the teachings of the sages, Hill the Elder, says that in giving charity, you should even give charity to a man to provide him with a horse to ride on and a servant to go ahead of him, announcing his coming. Which sounds pretty strange. And what he was talking about is that there's a wealthy man who he lost his money, and he was ashamed to go out in public because he had become so accustomed to riding on a fine horse and having a servant ahead of him. And what Hill is saying that is you need to take people's psychological needs into effect as well as their physical needs. But the other side of that is, would you want to be this person who has grown so dependent on your luxury that you can't function when you're reduced to mere subsistence? And I think that is one of the dangers of overindulgence, is that there's that, what do they call it? The hedonic treadmill, where our happiness resets. And the things that were luxuries become necessities. And now we have to look farther. So it's unhealthy for us, and it's unhealthy for the culture around us. And then the last thing I'll tell you was a Jewish story about the collectors from the Federation came to a wealthy Jew, and they said, "Mr. Goldman, we know about your yacht, and we know about your fleet of cars, and we know about your vacation homes. It's time that you contribute to the community." He says, "Really, you know about that? Do you know about my mother, who is infirm and needs full-time care? Do you know about my sister, who has a terrible disease and needs medical help? Do you know about my cousins who need basic needs? And if I don't give to them, I'm certainly not going to give to you."
I thought you were going to work in the brother who thought he was a chicken.
So I also think, following that conversation, Jonas, and I would very much, as a chartered mechanical engineer, very much like to have the discussion on whether gravity does exist or not, because I think that could get very interesting.
I'm up for that.
Well, we try to take on topics of great gravity, so we may
Indeed,
get around
yeah.
to it. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer Elder, Tim Hawks, Mark O'Brien. Always a pleasure. Appreciate the depth of thought and the nuances that we've tried to address.
Thank you.
For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you would like to suggest, please go to jonasandgoldson.com, use the contact information, send it in. If it's compelling, we will take it up. And please join us for future episodes as our panel grapples with the gray.